If your stitches are acting up at your machine quilting project and you're blaming your machine, hold up. There's a better explanation. Whether it's ugly stitches or skip stitches or weird sort of tension going on, there are so many factors that go into the formation of a beautiful stitch. Most of the time, it is not actually the machine's fault. So today I want to walk you through 7 things that I wish I had known early in my quilting experience. These things help you to know, to diagnose, to narrow down where the issue is, and it's simple fixes, simple solutions, things that you can learn, no fancy machine or equipment required. And these simple things can make a huge difference in the results and in your satisfaction in your machine quilting journey. First off, it is critical to get to know your machine and equipment. This is not one that's easy to quantify in words, but experience has taught me, and I bet it has taught you the same thing if you've been sewing for any length of time. Every sewing machine just behaves a little differently. Perhaps some like cotton threads, and some like silky or slick threads, and some like fine. They're just those simple little things that machines can prefer. And then there's mechanical things like some have thread cutters, or you've got to pull the threads and cut the tail. Some have an automatic presser foot lifter, or you've got to push a button or move it with your knee, right? So there's all these little different intricacies that you get to know and that become sort of second nature when you're stitching at that machine. So literally putting in some time stitching at it and playing with it and getting familiar with those features honestly will go a long way toward helping you figure out what the issue is when indeed a problem is happening. The first thing that I want to talk to you about, though, that is easily fixable and that maybe you didn't know and will be an aha moment for you, is this. Whether you're quilting at a longarm machine or a sit-down longarm or at a domestic sewing machine, there is one thing that you need to always do, no exceptions. That is, when you start stitching, pull up your bobbin thread to the top. And the way that you do that is quite simple. You hang on to the top thread, you cause your machine, if you've got a hand wheel, flywheel, or one click of a button perhaps at a longarm, whatever you need to do to cause your machine to take one full stitch. Then if you tug on that top thread a little, you'll see that the bobbin thread loop is poking up to the top of the surface. Grab hold of that bobbin thread and pull it through. And now you've got both tails at the top of your working area, and you can see them both and hang on to them both. So this is critical for a couple of reasons. First off, if you don't do this, if you just start stitching, that bobbin thread that's resting on the bottom underneath the fabric where you can't see it will 100% of the time form a little rat's nest under there, a little knot or gnarl of thread. Never a pretty thing. That is 100% eliminated by simply pulling that thread to the top and hanging on to it. And of course, just being able to see it, to have it visible, and of course in your grasp, goes a long way too toward avoiding any problems. So again, hang on to that top thread, take one full stitch down and up. That will pull up the bobbin loop. Tug on the top thread a little if you need to, pull up that bobbin loop, and now that you have it in view, grab it and pull it out so you've got a tail held in your hand. From here, you can take different measures to hang on to it. It might be as simple as just placing your finger on it. You might wrap it around your finger a time or two. If you really need both hands free, you can always put a pin in your fabric. But some way, somehow, you need to hang on to those 2 threads when you start stitching. That eliminates the problem of the tails getting tangled up in each other. That right off the bat will streamline and make so much prettier your quilting, because you'll have pretty stops and starts. Second thing that you really need to know, bobbin winding and tension are really critical in forming pretty stitches. The reason for this is both your top thread and your bobbin thread are being fed into the machine, and if they're being fed evenly and smoothly, makes sense that you'll get smooth and consistent stitches, right? If your bobbin is wound inconsistently or far too loose, or it has far too much tension on it, then you'll end up with either poor tension in your stitches or uneven tension in your stitches. Ways that this might happen. Let's say you have an external bobbin winder, meaning it's set on some kind of apparatus separate from your machine, and maybe the motor in that is not working well, and it speeds up and it slows down, and it speeds up and it slows down. You can imagine the thread will be winding sometimes tighter, sometimes looser, right? Or if the thread, which passes through some sort of tension disc, has slipped out of that disc and is just loosely winding without any control being applied by a tension disc, then it's going to have irregular, uneven tension as it's wound onto the bobbin. And you can imagine, if you put that in your machine and start stitching with it, it will sometimes release more quickly and sometimes more slowly, and you will not be able to get even tension and smooth stitches. So that bobbin winding is critical. There's lots more things about a bobbin that are important, but I'll mention just one other one here, and that is don't wind your bobbins too full. Now, most machines will have some type of automatic stop. So they'll have something perhaps that's resting on the bobbin, and when it gets almost full, pop, that will release and the bobbin will stop winding. But most of the time, that pressure point is adjustable. If your bobbin is winding full to the tip, then when you insert it in your machine and start using it, there will be a little bit of resistance as it's trying to spin around. So the better plan is to have your bobbin maybe 5% or only 3% less than full. So there's just a little bit of space between the thread and the outer rim of that bobbin. You are more likely to get a smooth and consistent result. Thirdly, something that is very important toward getting beautiful stitches is to have the appropriate needles, usually for the thread that you're working with, but sometimes for the fabric that you're working with too. Now, I'm just going to highlight on this a bit, but for more in-depth information, I recommend that you go either to needle manufacturer websites such as Schmetz Needles or Groesbeckert Needles, or thread manufacturer websites such as Superior Thread. They've practically got an education in thread and needles on their website, so you can go there for much more in-depth instruction and also for tables that recommend for this thread, this needle is appropriate, or these couple of needles, right? But in general, here are some thoughts about needles and thread. One is, the size of your thread needs to match the size of the eye of the needle. If you can imagine, if you have a thick thread and a fine needle with a very narrow eye, that thread is literally going to be pulled through the needle, and it's apt to shred and it's apt to break, especially if you're stitching at high speeds. On the other end of the scale, if you have a needle with a very large eye, a large size needle, and a very tiny thread, it's going to be flying all about in the eye of that needle and kind of uncontrolled. Also going to probably give you poor tension, uneven stitches. So it's important to match those up well to have an appropriate needle size for the thread that you're using. And again, I've linked some of these websites in the description below, so you can go there and find more detailed information. The thread that you like to use, what's the appropriate needle? Or the needles that you've got on hand, what are some appropriate threads to use with that? But believe me, this will make a massive difference in how well the stitches form on your fabric in your quilting project. Fourthly, and by the way, I didn't necessarily put these in order of importance other than the first one, pulling up the bottom thread, that's of primary importance. But some of these, I've just put them in order as they have occurred to me. But this one is threading your needle and your machine correctly. I know this sounds like a no-brainer. I know it does, but I've had it happen to me, and I bet it's happened to you sometimes too, that you miss either a tension disc or maybe one of those little pigtail thread holders. There's so many on certain machine models. It's all too easy to miss one, but every one has a reason for guiding the thread in a certain way, setting it up for the next thing, and if you miss one, you will have an issue. Or here's a more distinct example. One of my sewing machines, the needle actually threads from the right, and another of my machines, the needle threads from the left. Well, if you do the wrong one, you will be guaranteed to break thread. It will make about 3 stitches and then clunk, 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 boom, the thread will break, right? So you need to know what is the correct way to thread your machine and be sure that you've got that. And I will say here too, whenever I am having stitch formation issues, ugly stitches in any way, skip stitches, that sort of thing, This is usually the thing I check first. I take out the bobbin and rethread it, make sure that's all done correctly, and then I take my spool of thread off and rethread it to double check that it is all threaded correctly, because that is so often where the problem lies. Even if I threaded it correctly in the first place, sometimes just through use or through bumping through thick fabric or something, that thread can pop out of some of those holders or guides, right? And so it makes sense to use that as a diagnostic tool, right? Going back and rethreading the machine and just making sure that everything is threaded perfectly. Number 5, thing to watch for at your machine would be lint. Lint is a big old culprit in causing all kinds of problems at machines, from tiny sewing machines, featherweights, all the way up to the biggest long arm machines. Because lint gets in the way of the flow of the thread, because that smooth flow is absolutely critical to beautiful stitches, lint can get in the way of that. Lint can mess with your tension. Think of your bobbin casing, for example, and the little tiny spring that is holding the thread at its appropriate tension. If you get a little bundle of lint in there, and it doesn't take much, it will change the pressure on that spring, which will change the tension of your bobbin thread, which will change, you guessed it, the formation of your beautiful stitches. So keeping your bobbin area clean and lint-free is the best troubleshooting or preventive action that you can possibly take. So this involves several things. This usually involves popping up the presser plate, right, that rests below your needle, that your needle goes through. So you usually can pop that off or unscrew it, depending on your machine model, and get some kind of just hardware store variety paintbrush with good, fairly stiff bristles, and brush that whole area. Even your hopper foot or your needle area, just brush all that lint out of all the area that you can see. Remove the bobbin as well from underneath and use the same brush to get in all the nooks and crannies and brush all that lint loose and free. If you have at your disposal any kind of vacuum, it's a great idea to suction all that loosely brushed lint out of there at that point and just get it out of the way. Otherwise, I sometimes keep on hand a very soft brush, like a makeup brush, that kind of clings to the lint, right? So after I've loosened it with my stiffer brush, then I will swipe in there with my softer brush and pull all that lint out. That is so critical. Most machine technicians or repair people do not recommend using canned air or aerosol air cans for that cleaning purpose. Though it does blast the lint out of the nooks and crannies, it also tends to blast it in toward the machine as opposed to pulling it out. So sucking it out is your better option. One further step you can take is with your bobbin casing to actually take a credit card or a folded piece of paper and run it under that little spring and see if you can clean any lint out of that area. If you don't have a card handy, a very fine pin will work too, but keep in mind that spring is very delicate and very soft, so don't use a robust pin or you're apt to overspring that spring, if you follow what I'm saying. So a very thin pin, or even safer, a business card or a folded piece of paper is a great idea to brush any lint out of that area. I do this type of cleaning frequently, every bobbin or two, and I use a very low lint thread. So even with that low lint thread, I have to frequently clean the lint out of my machines. If you're using a thread such as 100% cotton, that will have much more lint, and you might actually have to stop mid-bobbin and do some cleaning. So again, lint is your number one enemy. It is the best thing you can do to clean your machine of lint regularly to keep it running smoothly. A few years back, I had my sewing machine into a service technician for kind of its regular cleaning and maintenance. And we're standing there talking, and I kind of asked him, what's the number one issue that you see when people's machines aren't working well and they bring them to you to fix? What's the number one thing that you see? He didn't even have to think for a second. He said it's lint. It's almost always lint. He said he has found lint packed like a brick into the back of sewing machines because it's just accumulated and gotten pushed back in there and accumulated and pushed and accumulated and pushed until there's just a solid unmoving chunk and the moving parts can't move freely anymore. I personally have never seen a machine in that bad of shape, but I do know how quickly the lint collects. And so this is something you can easily do that keeps your machine running more smoothly and eliminates a whole bunch of stitch formation problems. Okay, thing number 6 that I wish that I had known. Now 6 and 7 are similar. One is at a long arm quilting machine and one is at a domestic sewing machine or sit down type of long arm. So let's talk those both through. We'll do the sit down machine first. When you are quilting at a sit down machine, there's kind of 2 ways you can do it. One is to have the feed dogs raised much like you would for sewing, and they're pulling your fabric through all the time. But often we are quilting at a sit down machine and using free motion skills. So we've got those feed dogs dropped and we're just moving the fabric around freely. This is a skill that is absolutely wonderful to cultivate. It's my favorite kind of quilting, is free motion, right? It's literally just doodling the quilting design on the fabric. But there is a bit of a caveat. This is a learned skill. And the part of it that's really tricky to learn is absolutely smooth movements. And if there's jerkiness in your movements, that messes with the formation of perfect stitches. So here's the fix for it. It's kind of twofold. One is you need to just get used to it, because that is a very different feel from sewing at your sewing machine. So if you've been sewing for years and years and years, that's great, but it's going to feel very different for you to drop the feed dogs down and be totally guiding the fabric on your own. And if you're brand new to quilting and sewing, honestly, you might find this a little easier. You have no sort of preconceived ideas or muscle memory about the movements of that fabric. But either way, the solution is the same. You've just got to do it often enough that you learn to relax your shoulders and smooth out your movements. But I also want to say, if you're just getting started and you're finding that your tension looks a little tighter here and a little looser there, especially on the underside of the fabric, don't fuss with that too much. Just keep practicing and see if it doesn't just smooth out as your movements smooth out. That can be the solution. It might not actually be that any tension settings are incorrect. It's just that you're learning to get that absolute smoothness of pace and movement, right? So give yourself grace and just do some practice. Practicing a little bit, a few times a week, is always preferable over one ginormous practice session. So give yourself 15 minutes here and there, once or twice a day if you can, to just get used to the feel of that and get used to that movement. And you'll soon find, after a few sessions, that your quilting has smoothed out. Beyond that, though I've been quilting for years and years and have done hundreds of quilts, I still find when I come to a quilting session and I haven't been quilting for a day or two, I need to do almost a warm-up. It's almost like a warm-up before our exercises. Like, you can't bend over and immediately touch your toes, but if you do a few stretches, then you can touch your toes. It's a bit like that. When I first sit down to quilt, it's a little bit jerky, a little bit uneven, but if I just give it even 5 minutes of fiddling around on a little practice sandwich, that smooths out and starts to get better. So that's a really long explanation for something that does affect the beauty of your stitches, and it can simply be the lack of smoothness in your movement. So those are some ways to even that out. Lastly, if you are working at a long arm, it's easier to achieve smoothness of movement because you'll be holding the handlebars and moving the machine, and your arms are fairly well in control, and even a beginner can usually keep that pace fairly even. However, there's a couple of other things to consider when you're working at a long arm machine. And one of them is the height of your quilting surface that you're working on, so that you're not hunched over and squeezing in at it, or also that you're maybe not working at arm's length really far away from you. So think about working in your comfort zone as much as you can for appropriate height and for closeness to the machine. For example, my long arm machine has a 24-inch throat space, so my quilting area is just over 20 inches. So if I'm quilting literally 20 inches away from my chest, that feels like arm's length to me, and that can be difficult to control and to keep smooth movements. If I stay about 3 or 4 inches closer for the bulk of my quilting, it becomes a lot easier for me to control. And then one other thing that you need to watch out for at your long arm, and this really does affect stitch formation directly, and that is the tension of your quilt. So because it's rolled onto a rail at the front and onto a rail at the back, how much you tighten those rails will affect how tight that quilt sandwich is, right? And so it needs to be only tight enough so that it's not sagging and drooping, right? You do not want it cranked down as tight as a drum. If your fabric is that tight, you will run into broken threads and skipped stitches. So if that's a problem you're having, think about double checking the tension of your quilt. And then the other way that you adjust it is by having some sort of side clamps on the quilt as well. I always use side clamps on the edges of my quilt to keep a little bit of tension, to keep any wrinkles from forming. But again, you do not want to crank down like a drum, right? You don't want to be able to bounce a coin off your quilt surface. You only want it tight enough so that it's not literally sagging on your long arm frame. So that tension is really, really critical to maintaining perfect stitches. So all of these things that I've talked about refer back to the actual process of a stitch being formed, which is the needle going down and the rocker portion of your bobbin coming up, grabbing that thread and forming a stitch. So this is just a movement that's repeated many times in a second, right? So all of these things are ways that you're helping your machine, which is only mechanical, to be positioned to make the most beautiful stitches possible. You're keeping that lint out of place. You're keeping hold of the thread tails when you begin. You're having your fabric sandwich, if you're working at a long arm machine, at the appropriate tension. You're moving smoothly if you're guiding the fabric under the needle. All these things come together to help create beautiful stitches that look good both on the top and on the bottom. That's the quilter's ultimate aim. So if you are interested in learning more about these things, I do have a course that talks through these things in much more depth and more topics too that have to do with the mechanics of free motion quilting, assessing a quilt, choosing needle and thread, which we've talked about a little today, also choosing batting, loading processes, basting, all these things. Also check out the other episodes in this playlist, which talk more and more about how you are the exact right person to finish your own quilts. I'm on a mission to help every quilt maker finish the quilts that they've already pieced and be able to either use them and love them in their own home or give them away for others to love.